Why they call me the master of magnetism. Fight! Disruptor! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! 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 Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Shockwave! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Hypergram! Insignificant hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! 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 Hypergram! Disruptor! Force field! Disruptor! Hypergram! 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 Magnetic blast! Disruptor! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Shockwave! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Shockwave! Hypergram! Disruptor! Force field! Away with Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Force field! Hypergram! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! 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 Hypergram! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Magnetic Disruptor! Insignificant! What hope did you have against the master of magnetism?
Round 2, fight!
Disruptor! Hypergram! Magnetic Hypergram! Disruptor! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! 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 Hypergram! Magnetic blast! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Disruptor! This was mutant plane! Accept your failure! Magnetic blast! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Magnetic blast! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Magnetic! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Magnetic blast! Hypergram! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Attraction! Disruptor! 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 Hypergram! Disruptor! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Magnetic! Magnetic! Hypergram! Insignificant! Hypergram! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Magnetic! Disruptor! Hypergram! Magnetic disruptor! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Magnetic Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Shockwave! Magnetic! Magnetic attraction! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! 世界は広いの
Round 3. Fight!
Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Shockwave! Disruptor! Hypergram! Away with you! Disruptor! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! I'm lost! Magnetic! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Hypergram! Disruptor! Disruptor! Hypergrab! Disruptor! Magnetic shockwave! Disruptor! Hypergrab! Disruptor! 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 Hypergrab! Disruptor! Hypergrab! Disruptor! Another attraction! Hypergrab! Disruptor! Hypergrab! Disruptor! Disruptor! Hypergrab! Disruptor! Disruptor! Hypergrab! Disruptor! Hypergrab! Disruptor! Hypergrab! Disruptor! Level up! Magnetic Disruptor! Attraction! Magnetic Disruptor! Magnetic Disruptor! Hypergrab! 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 Disruptor! Disruptor mutant pride! Accept your failure! Hypergrab! Disruptor! Hypergrab! Disruptor! Hypergrab! Disruptor! Hypergrab! Disruptor! Disruptor! Hypergrab! Disruptor! Disruptor! Hypergrab! Away with this magnetic tempest! Hypergrab! Disruptor!